Hello, I'm Jim Townsend, Director of the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy at Wayne State University Law School. To celebrate Black History Month, the Levin Center invited Professor Robert Bland of the University of Tennessee to discuss his new book, Requiem for Reconstruction, Black Countermemory and the Legacy of the Lowcountry's Lost Political Generation. Professor Bland is an assistant professor of history at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he has a joint appointment in the Department of History and the Department of Africana Studies. Professor Bland's work focuses on the late 19th and early 20th century United States with an emphasis on the African American experience, the postbellum South, and his research really engages questions of racial formation, electoral and cultural politics, and battles over historical memory. Welcome, Professor Bland.
Jim, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to being in conversation with you this afternoon.
Well, I certainly enjoyed reading your book, and it just seems like such a timely contribution to our understanding of not only this critical period of American history, but really, a period of incredible division between Americans, but also really something that has a lot to say about our own time. So I'm really looking forward to honoring Black History Month and talking about this critically important history, but also maybe getting into a little bit of how it relates to the period we're living through now. So I guess I would kick things off by just saying, you have just come out with this book, Requiem for Reconstruction, literally, this month here, January. We're recording this in January 2026, and it's a fascinating study of the period of Reconstruction, not only the battle that African Americans engaged in to secure their civil and economic rights, but also their struggle during and after Reconstruction to secure the narrative and battle against a counter narrative of what Reconstruction was, that was put forward by whites in both the South and the North to really serve the interests of white supremacy. So I guess I want to kick off this conversation by asking you what prompted you to write this book? What were the goals that you had for this project, and what kinds of gaps were you trying to fill in both sort of the historical record and in public understanding?
Thank you for that question, Jim. I wrote this book as a way to think about the legacy of Reconstruction in American memory broadly, but African American memory in particular. And there's a number of works that are coming out of the last 20 or 30 years that examine Reconstruction in memory. David Blight's Race and Reunion may be the most recognizable of those efforts to reconstruct the legacy of the post-Civil War era in American memory. But I'm also particularly interested in the various ways that African American communities wrestled with the legacy of Reconstruction in ways that don't always appear in both our national memory, but also in the debates historians have about Reconstruction. We have a lot of work that has examined forms of African American counter memory, right? The parades, Black Union veterans' efforts to preserve memories of the war, but around the specific historical storytelling of Reconstruction and what Reconstruction meant, and debates within the Black community about Reconstruction meant. As I entered the archives and I explored some of these questions on my own, I saw that there's a bigger story here that had not been told.
Well, it was certainly a story that I knew something about in reading the book, but really it opened my eyes to a number of issues I want us to get into, because I think our audience would really appreciate that. But before we go further into this, it seemed to me that for a lot of us, it might be a good idea to define some terms that we'll be using during this conversation and are obviously replete in the book. The first one, of course, is Reconstruction. So perhaps it would be a good idea for you to just sort of provide a definition of what was Reconstruction, just so for people who may not understand exactly what that term really refers to.
Right. No, that's an important question. I think of Reconstruction along the lines of three valences. First, there's literally the project of reconstructing the American South after the Civil War, the destruction of slavery and what will come after, the rehabilitation of labor relationships, going from a world built on slave labor to a world built on free labor. The efforts and the project of occupying the South, right? There's a moment in history where the federal military has to hold troops in various regions of the South to rebuild the region, to kind of reconstruct the region, to push back against paramilitary violence in that region. Literal, kind of what does it mean to reconstruct? And then there's another valence where we're talking about rebuilding the political architecture. What does it mean to add the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution? To think about a more active federal government, to establish national citizenship, what will become what we know as birthright citizenship, and finally the federal protections under the 15th Amendment. Finally, this is both a historical and historiographical question. What does Reconstruction mean in how we understand the American past? How do we think about these battles over the Civil War? What does it mean to understand American history as not always having a linear, triumphant narrative, that sometimes there's tragedy? And it's particularly in the Reconstruction era, the various tensions that shape this rebuilding effort, informing the storytelling of the past and those major historical battles that happen over the formation of the American historical profession. And so how do we think about Reconstruction as a historical problem? How do we think about Reconstruction as a moment in political remaking and remapping? And then finally, what does it literally mean to rebuild the South from the studs, from the bottom up?
And so much of your book is devoted to talking about the struggles over those various valences and the way people define them. Another aspect of your book is geography. So the book, the title, and much of the book's work focuses on this area of the country called the Lowcountry. And so for people who are maybe not as familiar with the American Southeast, maybe you could say a word about not just the geography of the Lowcountry, where it was or where it is, but also why it's important to the history of Reconstruction and to the civil and political empowerment of Black people.
Right. So for those who are not familiar, the Lowcountry broadly is a region of the American Southeast that stretches from the coast of southern North Carolina around Cape Fear to the northern point of Florida around Jacksonville. The epicenter tends to be Charleston through Savannah, Georgia. In the book, I'm examining that particular region, Charleston, Savannah, and most specifically, the town and county of Beaufort, which in many ways was the political and cultural epicenter of Reconstruction in the American Southeast. Many scholars have examined and explored Reconstruction. It plays an outsized role in the history of the Civil War, in the history of slavery, in the history of the post-slavery South. Demographically, it is one of the highest density of enslaved people. In many ways, the Lowcountry served as the Ellis Island for African Americans during slavery. Peter Wood, the great historian, has written a fantastic book called Black Majority, talking about the specific ways that as a Black majority region, African cultures were retained, the specific plantation system emerged that allowed for more African American autonomy. This is the center of the Gullah Geechee folk culture in the United States, and the region is often called the Gullah Geechee Corridor. It's recognized as a kind of center of Gullah Geechee culture in the United States. And so all of those kind of cultural and social stories are also swirling around the specific political story I'm telling about Reconstruction.
Fascinating. Now, I want to just touch on two other terms that I think are important. There are so many others, but I think just to try to boil a few things down, there is quite a bit of discussion in your book about this concept of racial destiny for Black people. How is that term understood? What did it mean? And why is it so important to this history?
Right. Now, this is a term coined by Michelle Mitchell, historian of the African American experience at New York University. But she's identifying this long pattern of African Americans, especially after Reconstruction, engaged in a broader debate about racial formation. Right. This is a specific moment in the mid-19th century as slavery is on the wane, as it's literally being destroyed by the Union Army. There are major questions about the destiny of Black Americans after slavery. This is a debate that involves questions of education. It involves questions of political agency. It involves questions of culture and kind of what does a shared culture look like. It's not a foregone conclusion that a national African American identity will exist. And even as people are formulating ideas of what it means to be Black in America after slavery, there's much to be debated, There's many points of contestation around what it means to be a Black American. And you see these debates happening in kind of spheres of high culture and literary circles and newspapers, but also in the ground, right? In places like the Lowcountry, in places like Louisiana, in places like New York, anywhere where there's a Black community, there are these debates about what Black people as a collective should do, right? So sometimes political scientists call this a shared destiny or a kind of linked fate kind of thesis around how a group kind of understands itself as having common interests, common cause. Most famously, Stephen Hahn has kind of wrestled with this question, A Nation Under Our Feet, in his magnum opus on slavery and the kind of post-slavery political thought in Black America. But this is something that is taken seriously and something that I examine as a way to understand memory, understand political agency, and to understand the practice of African American history.
So that's very helpful. And lastly, there are a number of kind of terms and holidays and various sort of occasions for recognizing the effort in the Civil War and what took place after the Civil War. But one of them in particular is this occasion called Decoration Day. It's an annual observance. A lot of folks might not really know what Decoration Day is, depending on where you are, where you're from in the country. So maybe you could describe what Decoration Day is and why it was so significant during this period and really ever since.
Thank you for that question. Decoration Day is a holiday first established by formerly enslaved people in Charleston, South Carolina, to honor the Union dead. The first Decoration Day was practiced or celebrated in 1865, and it continued to be celebrated across the American Southeast and eventually right across the nation. This is a holiday that is the precursor for Memorial Day. And so we all have a strong understanding what Memorial Day meant. But part of the job of the historian is to recover these moments, these practices, these cadences of time that we no longer have a great grasp on or no longer have a deep connection to. And in the Lowcountry, right, this is essentially a high holiday, right? This is a site of Union occupation. This is one of the strongest sites of Southern Unionism. Obviously, this is a site of incredible Black political power that's connected to the Republican Party and by extension connected to the memory of the Union. And so in the Lowcountry, Decoration Day takes on this grand scale. It's a holiday where people from all across, not only the Lowcountry, but the American Southeast travel. Speakers who are affiliated with the Union give a major address. It's a place where racial destiny is discussed and progress since emancipation is discussed. This is an important kind of moment for understanding what the Civil War meant. And as we get into the late 19th and early 20th century, this is an important holiday for understanding what Reconstruction meant.
And it really was an annual opportunity to counter the myth making that started to occur following the Civil War and certainly following Reconstruction, where African Americans would come together to remind themselves and remind others what the Civil War was really about, what Reconstruction was actually trying to accomplish, what was accomplished, and then, of course, what was being wiped out. So it just struck me as among other occasions, a particularly important thing for everybody to understand. Now I'd like to turn, if I may, to some of the people that are in this rich account, and the person who kind of plays the largest role in the narrative you've written is a war hero and politician named Robert Smalls. He is somebody who was a larger than life figure and really was on the scene for a long period throughout this postbellum time. Could you tell the story a little bit about Robert Smalls and why he is so significant?
Certainly. Robert Smalls is a figure who's relatively well known among historians of the Civil War, of Reconstruction, of the African American experience, but doesn't get his just due in our national memory. In many ways, he is one of the great heroes of the 19th century. Born enslaved in Charleston, he's pushed into labor for the Confederate Navy, has experience navigating vessels of all shapes and sizes, but sees an opportunity for freedom during the Civil War. And so in May 1862, he and members of his family are on board a Confederate vessel, the CSS Planter. They navigate this vessel past several Confederate naval checkpoints, which require mastery of a series of naval signals. He is under disguise, so they can't recognize that this is an enslaved man who's navigating this vessel, and successfully delivers this vessel from the Confederate Navy to the Union Navy. Immediately becomes a larger-than-life figure, right? This is a heroic feat worthy of a major Hollywood motion picture. After the war, he plays a major role in establishing schools in the Lowcountry, gets involved in founding the first Republican Party in the region, and remains an important politician at the State House and the State Senate, and later serving 5 terms in the U.S. Congress. His political career extends well into the 1880s, helping us see the story of Reconstruction extending past this traditional 1877 endpoint. And even after his congressional career, he serves as a federally appointed figure in the U.S. Customs House in the Lowcountry, which allows him to kind of gain and hold the tremendous amounts of political power, remain connected to the National Republican Party. This is a figure who has a tremendous amount of political acumen, who embodies this journey from slavery to freedom, and in many ways is the living representation of a counter-memory of Reconstruction.
You know, one of the things that really struck me about your account of his experience and all of the things he accomplished was how much he was sort of the embodiment of many of the conflicts that were taking place, not just, you know, his attempt to try to deal with the shifting power situation as federal troops are withdrawn and as the political ground starts to you know, shake underneath the Black community that had obviously been moving toward you know, what was they had hoped at least was going to be a multiracial democracy. But in this period when after Reconstruction, there's a tremendous amount of change and a lot of I guess you'd say diversity of views about what the Black community should be trying to do in this shifting political environment. I guess I'd like you to talk a little bit about that shifting situation, because I don't think people who aren't experts in this field understand just how obviously how rapid the change was as white Southerners, grab back power after the departure of federal troops. But that leaves the Black community and leaders like Robert Smalls in a very difficult situation, trying to figure out how to preserve power, how to do as much as they can to support people in the community while also recognizing sort of the political realities that they were facing.
Right. And this is one of the more complicated needles that I had to thread during the book. On the one hand, right, Robert Smalls is a hero, full stop. On the other hand, right, he is a bridge between what you might say is 2 eras in African-American politics, navigating this world that across the South, Reconstruction governments are being violently overthrown. Paramilitary forces are using tremendous amounts of violence to redeem, and we can put that in scare quotes, the South for white supremacy, for the Democratic Party. Robert Smalls is one of the few politicians who survives this moment, right? He is what I call the last Reconstruction era congressman, the last Black congressman who had served in the House before 1877 and also after, well into the 1880s. That makes him a certain type of political survivor, but that also ties him closer to the 0-degree moment of emancipation and enslavement. For many Black Americans, as they're imagining a second chapter in the story of racial destiny, imagining a moment where a talented 10th is emerging, educated Black leaders who are attending and graduating from a new set of institutions of higher education like Howard University, Lincoln University, other historically Black colleges, university, see themselves as the rightful leaders of Black America. Robert Smalls, again, born enslaved, never had a chance to receive a formal education, speaks with a Gullah patois, is unrecognizably a freed person of a different generation. As we enter the 1880s, he represents the past in a way that is uncomfortable for many Black leaders who are looking to the future, right? And racial destiny is always a project that has an eye on a new racial future, right? A kind of higher octave of Black freedom, of what Black American identity would be, which is often elitist, which is often Whiggish, which is often exclusionary, right? Of kind of working class people, of women, of those who are outside of this narrow, talented 10th. And so when Robert Smalls is serving in office, and as kind of again, he becomes a sort of political celebrity because he's one of the last Black office holders in the Congress. Many in the Black press, many in the talented 10th question whether Robert Smalls should remain this focal point of Black racial destiny, of the Black America's racial future. In those battles, we're also seeing another debate, which I hope to articulate in the book, which is what does Robert Smalls mean in the legacy of Reconstruction? And how does Robert Smalls understand this legacy? He's not someone who takes these attacks lightly. He creates his own newspapers to challenge the attacks of Northern Black elites. He continues to work with Republican leaders to make the argument for federal election protection. He himself is a historian of Reconstruction and makes his own arguments seen and heard throughout the public sphere of the 19th century.
One thing I think would be interesting to our audience is just how dramatic a change Reconstruction brought about in the makeup of the power structure for that whatever roughly 12-year period when Black suffrage was extended. Black men could vote, and that brought about the election of Black leaders to many offices, both state and federal, and local, state and federal. I think people don't understand just how significant that change was, at least for the period until federal troops were withdrawn, and then there was this, tremendous recapturing of power and oppression visited by Southern Democrats. Maybe you could just do you have a few facts or just a way to sort of set that scene for just how there was this period of multiracial democracy in parts of the South and many parts of the South, and how much it was wrenched away following the end of federal presence.
Right. One way to set this up, right? Part of the Lowcountry story is not only a Black majority story, but it's also a white minority story, right? The white planter class who occupies power in the colonial and antebellum period is one of the more powerful groups of people that we see in U.S. history, right? These are the architects of secession. And when you read those secession documents, right, one of the key arguments was that the Declaration of Independence was argued incorrectly, right? That rather than arguing all people are created equally, the natural order of things is hierarchy. And this is, again, one of these major debates, right? On the one hand, we understand the project of democracy, right? The project of representation, right? Generally, we want to believe that democracy is a good thing. And throughout the 18th and 19th century, we should understand that that is a deeply contested project. So it takes a long time for all white men to get the suffrage. It's certainly going to take a long time for women to get the suffrage. And African Americans not only getting the right to vote across the South, but being elected to every possible office from the local to the state level to the federal is a radical reversal in the American South, right? The abolitionists certainly had a broad vision, what W.E.B. Du Bois would call abolition democracy. But again, the South was a bastion for hierarchy, right? That's the social and cultural logic of slavery. With the destruction of slavery, those ideas don't disappear. So when African Americans who had once been enslaved are elevated to the Congress, to the state legislature, to local offices like sheriff, those former slaveholders and their descendants see this as a violent rupture of their desired political order, right? The overthrow of Reconstruction is a pushing back on broad ideas of democracy. And again, you can go to the Constitution and see various ways that, again, Madisonian checks and balances also thought about the pitfalls of democracy. And part of the arc of the 19th to 20th century in U.S. history is how do you make the argument for more and more democracy? And Reconstruction is one of those moments where you see a strong push, but you also see a strong push back against an expansive idea of a democratic society.
And that pushback really is the environment that Robert Smalls and many of his contemporaries were dealing in the period after 1876. The Republican Party, as you pointed out, was dominant and became dominant in the South in the immediate, post-war period because Black men had the vote, and there was already a Black majority population in many of these parts of the South, in the Lowcountry particularly, and so that translated into political power. But of course, that disappeared, or at least that started. There was a dramatic retrenchment and a dramatic reaction against that when troops were pulled out. So the Republican Party's fortunes in the South declined rapidly with the elimination, or at least the rapid destruction of the ability of Black men to vote in the South. Meanwhile, you've got a Democratic Party that is essentially trying to grab control and dominate. But this period that you're describing in the 1880s is a transitional period. And that's where Robert Smalls and many of his contemporaries are doing some very interesting things to survive politically, to try to make the most of opportunities to preserve the rights of Black people or the power, or at least the power that they held. Could you describe a little bit about the interesting coalitions and interesting efforts, third parties, and other things that were done to, in some cases, make common cause with poor whites in the South? And just, in the brief time we have, describe sort of how some of that played out.
Right, right. Now, this is an important aspect of history that many historians of the American South, the postbellum South, have tried to illuminate, but often aren't fully seen or recognized in our national memory of Southern history. And so, yes, the Republican Party as a vehicle to win statewide elections is largely over by the time we get to the 1880s. And yet, at the local level, especially in major cities and in kind of these remaining Black majority regions like the Lowcountry, there are possibilities for coalitions between Blacks and whites. At the populist level, lowercase p populist level, you see organizations like the Farmers Alliance and the Colored Farmers Alliance, which see the rapidly shifting fortunes in the Southern landscape hurting both poor whites and poor Blacks. Poor white yeoman farmers are following behind as the cotton economy is becoming more market-oriented. More people are pulled into a market economy that does not favor small landholders. African Americans are trying to move up an agricultural ladder, often stuck as shareholders, with a form of debt peonage, which kind of leads to a type of second slavery, a type of debt peonage. And those organizations work together trying to come up with populist economic policies that potentially would bring poor whites and poor Blacks together in a way that would challenge landholding elites, that would provide softer monetary policy, build ways to store agricultural products until the market gets better. So many historians of populist movements and Farmers Alliance, I think of Ed Ayers and the Promise of the New South, highlight these coalitions. There are also coalitions that are happening between high-ranking Black Republican leaders and white elites in what is called fusion arrangements. Robert Smalls navigates one of these arrangements where those who believe that they are stewards of good government, that understand the art of the possible in politics, find more moderate white Southerners who seek political office, who understand that white supremacy is not necessarily in the favor of all people, share offices. They decide African-American political makers, office holders will hold some of those offices, white elites will hold other forms of office, and that they can arrange and navigate a new South environment on a coalitional basis. You also see this in Wilmington, North Carolina, and many people are familiar with the famous coup d'etat that overthrows that government in Wilmington. But that is an arrangement where, again, Black Republicans and white elites were sharing office and working together rather than kind of a full rise of white supremacy all together all at once, right? It's a 1880s and 1890s is a really interesting time period where you see many advocates of white supremacy being pushed back by both working class whites, by some kind of moderate white elites, and certainly by Black Republicans who understand that the legacy of Reconstruction can persist if the needle is thread carefully in this treacherous political terrain.
And ultimately, what happened? I mean, it seemed like these efforts ultimately were unsuccessful. They fell victim to what? How would you describe the efforts to stamp these efforts out, or how, what sort of played out in the late sort of 19th century, that early 20th century, that caused these alliances to collapse?
Right. It took a more sophisticated form of white supremacy. So calls for white supremacy, kind of all white Southerners to unite together, often fell on deaf ears in the 1880s, as again, many poor white farmers did not necessarily see themselves in alliance with white elites. White elites didn't necessarily want to reach out to the farmers in the backwoods in the upcountry. In South Carolina, a specific politician, Benjamin Tillman, emerges, who had been part of some of these paramilitary mobs that overthrew Reconstruction in the 1870s, overthrew the Republican government, while Republicans in the Lowcountry still had office. He serves 2 terms as governor in the late 1880s and 1890s. And as he's doing so, he's developing a new argument about the danger of Reconstruction and the danger the afterlife of Reconstruction might play for white farmers, and particularly for white women. Right? The idea that Negro domination could be connected to white men not being able to protect their households, not be able to protect their wives, not be able to protect their daughters. Sometimes this is made very explicitly, and sometimes this is made in the dog whistle politics. By the time you get to 1895, Tillman is heading to the U.S. Senate, and one of his last efforts is to bring together these white Democrats who are dominating the state house, have control of the executive branch, and they call a new constitutional convention. This is the second major constitutional convention after 1877. The first was in Mississippi. They leave most of the Constitution, which would have been rewritten during the Reconstruction in 1868, intact. But what they add are literacy tests. What they add is a grandfather clause that allows those white men who can't pass a literacy test to vote if their grandfather could vote before the 1868 Constitution. And they add property qualifications. Everyone knows what's happening here. As far as the 1870, when the 15th Amendment is passed, people recognize that that might be a mechanism that would be used to disfranchise Black voters. But again, politicians like Tillman, and you see this certainly in the 1898 Wilmington riot, which is sparked by accusations that white men are not able to protect white women, and that is happening precisely because Black government still persists.
In Wilmington,
you see this resurgent white supremacy that consolidates power, and by the time you get to the early 20th century, you essentially see a solid South that has domination over the political landscape.
And the monuments and all the push to build Confederate monuments to the Confederacy was an artifact or a part of that sort of cultural and political signaling of that same period. Is that correct?
That's right. At the point that the Republican Party is defeated, that these last bastions of Reconstruction era politics are defeated, and essentially a way to sand the landscape and silence the past, you see these Confederate monuments. At the point that first you have disfranchisement, then you have segregation laws, and then after that you begin to see Confederate monuments across the landscape. Obviously you have major monuments to Robert E. Lee as early as 1890, but the high water mark of the Confederate commemoration is the early 20th century, and that is precisely at the point that Republican rule at the state, local level has been defeated, and new countermemory, the original countermemory, right, the lost cause, with the help of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, changes textbooks, puts up monuments, demands during Decoration Days that Confederate veterans should be celebrated, and they often segregate those Decoration Days in ways to preserve and establish their own vision of the Southern past.
So they'd have a celebration for one race in the morning for Decoration Day, and then there'd be a celebration for another race, either blacks in the morning, whites in the afternoon, or vice versa, to drive home this point. Precisely. Well, I want to shift gears, Professor Blaine, if I may, to more the civic life of African Americans that grew up during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, both as a way of supporting a drive toward freedom, a drive toward equality, but also an effort to preserve the memory and the facts and the truth about Reconstruction. So I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about some of the institutions that grew up in this period in the Lowcountry in particular. Obviously, they had echoes and partners in other parts of the country, but maybe you could name some of the people, some of the institutions that were really important to this flowering of African-American civic identity, civic culture, and ways in which they preserved this history and told this story for generations.
Right. And it's a complicated and complex network of institutions. At the center is the Republican Party, right? The Republican Party is a vehicle for political life, but it's also a vehicle for associational life. It's at the center of commemorative culture, like Decoration Days, like Emancipation Days, and stretching out from the Republican Party, you have organizations like the Union League, which essentially serves as a Black paramilitary organization during the early Reconstruction era. You have later the Grand Army of the Republic, and one of the most powerful chapters of the Grand Army of the Republic is based in Beaufort County, which serves as a site of associational life, allows veterans of the Civil War to meet, to drill, to invite speakers from across the nation who are involved with the Union military, and often they're kind of at the center of these local holidays. The National Guard, state militia, plays a major point in kind of one of the reasons that Black political power persists in the Lowcountry for so long, right, is that there is such a strong local chapter of the National Guard that Robert Smalls also sits at the top of, that allows for a both cultural and social capacity, right? That allows people to see parades, it allows people to organize and share memory, but it also literally serves as a source of protection, right? There are moments in the 1870s and 1880s where Robert Smalls is under tremendous threat when he's campaigning across the state, and whenever a nearby chapter of such an organization hears that, they can kind of march into action and kind of serve as a force of protection. But at the center of this story is also a story of the Black public sphere and the Black press. The national Black press is deeply interested in what's going on in the Lowcountry, reports on this, and in many ways, this is a story about the emergence of a Black political beat, right? A kind of a certain type of Black political reporting emerges around Reconstruction broadly, and what I would argue around reporting the events in South Carolina in particular, trying to defend those political events and the political history there against not only the lost cause, but increasingly a negative portrait of Black political life in the Northern press, in the national press. And so this allows and kind of creates a larger web of Black newspapers. The Lowcountry produces a number of them, but across the South during the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, you see this flowering of the Black press in a way that builds up a larger collective vision of Black America, allows Black Americans living in postbellum South to see themselves stitched together with a broader Black community.
So you had, these Black militias, you had these, Grand Army of the Republic, alumni basically of the Civil War associations. You had the press, the Black press, but there were also these fascinating literary societies that I did not know really anything about, well, a tiny bit about, that you described so vividly. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about them. The one that I remember the most from your account is the Bethel Literary Society. And what struck me so much about that organization was how open it was, even though it really featured some of the most elite minds in the Black community from across the country. There'd be, these high-level speakers and scholars and so on, journalists. But it wasn't just for the elites; it was open to all people. Talk a little bit about how important the Bethel Literary Society and organizations like it were to this emerging identity and emerging culture.
Right, right. And this is a history that others have remarked on. Imani Perry writes about various literary societies in postbellum Black America. To understand 19th century American life broadly, right? You have to understand the importance of the Lyceum, that where there was not a movie theater or Netflix or any type of easy entertainments that we have today, often people found real engagement in hearing a public lecture and hearing a speech, right? And this is an era where people memorize speeches, right? Where people would hear public readings of Shakespeare, right? The idea that a literary culture could be a mass culture. We should not see those two as kind of distinctive, right? They're not mutually exclusive. In the postbellum moment, right, you see a number of literary societies that are both serving this broader purpose of mapping and naming a racial destiny, debating the major issues that Black America is facing, but more narrowly, right, are interested in the march of Black history. And I begin the book with a debate in the Bethel Literary Society, which takes place in Washington, D.C. at the Metropolitan AME Church. This is a major organization, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, in shaping the story of Reconstruction in the South. The Metropolitan AME Church is one of the largest and most visible churches of that denomination. And the Bethel Hall, which is an auxiliary of the church, hosts a weekly lyceum where all across the Black community in Washington, D.C. are available and are encouraged to attend. But also members of the Black press from across the country are attending these and reporting back on these events and often carrying those conversations with their newspaper readers and often forming their own literary societies in local communities. The Bethel Literary Society, in many ways, right, is the a major forerunner in the practice of African American history. We think about the 20th century as this moment where you see Carter G. Woodson, you see Negro History Week, which eventually becomes African American History Month. And we know that from that moment forward, you begin to see a kind of major spread of knowledge and tools to help teach African American history. You kind of have the important writing of W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, which helps introduce major arguments for African American agency into the national historical profession. But in organizations like the Bethel Literary Society, which doesn't get as much attention in African American history, you see major figures like Frederick Douglass, like Robert Smalls, like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, among others, debating the major issues of the day. It's well known in the time, right? It is probably the most august site of Black literary and historical thinking. But if you really push and you really dig, you see that one of the chords, one of the strands that is uniting and kind of returning and reoccurring over and over again is, what is the meaning of Reconstruction? How should we understand the legacy of the Reconstruction era, which I think is a grammar, a kind of a way of organizing a broader story of what does Black historical progress look like after the Civil War, after emancipation.
I want to return to General Small's life for a moment, because when I was reading your description of his journey and his leadership during the Civil War, his heroism, and then his civic and community and political leadership following that, he struck me as somebody who was in some ways like Congressman John Lewis, a legend of the civil rights movement, who went on to represent Georgia in the U.S. House of Representatives for decades, and was really seen by many people as sort of the conscience of the U.S. House. What sorts of parallels do you see between Robert Smalls and John Lewis? Obviously, very different people, but in some ways they held these positions of leadership, and in many ways were sort of like the embodiment of this memory, of this history that has become so contested.
Right. I really appreciate that comparison. I think it's usable in understanding a larger shaping of Black political life, a history of Black political life. One of the major terms in my book is the Reconstruction generation, right? I think of Robert Smalls as part of a cohort, a generational cohort that saw Reconstruction as this epoch-shaping moment in Black life. I, in part, came to that term because I think about the civil rights generation, right? The generation of individuals who are shaped by the civil rights movement and try to hold that story to a mirror of America. And there are various ways. There are historians who come out of the movement, there are activists who come out of the movement, but you have a generation of politicians like John Lewis who are representing major sites of Black political life, Black social life, like Atlanta. I think of Jim Clyburn coming out of Robert Small's old district. You can think about the Mississippi Delta, among other places, right? And even those who didn't serve in the movement understood that their generation of politicians emerges out of a 1965 moment. And I'm writing about a generation of politicians who come out of an 1865 moment, right? And it's not a novel, right? C. Van Woodward calls the civil rights movement the second Reconstruction. And there are many historians who draw links between the first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction. I think that there is a real importance in understanding a figure like John Lewis as an embodiment of a generational memory. And I think there's a real importance in thinking about Robert Smalls as an embodying a generational memory that helps not only the communities that they serve, but also a broader national consciousness of what history had occurred to get them in those positions.
Now, I wouldn't be representing the Levin Center very effectively in this conversation if I didn't ask you at least one question about the role of Congress in investigating some of the issues that are at play here. And one of those historic investigations is something that we have written about at the Levin Center, and others have written about, and that is the congressional investigation into the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s. There were two congressional investigations, one of them particularly impactful, which was an effort to hold the investigation included holding field hearings in the South, where Black Americans were given a platform to talk about the terrorism that was taking place at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan and other paramilitary organizations. It's been viewed by some, including Professor Henry Louis Gates, as kind of a unique instance where there was something of a truth and reconciliation process, not adequate by any means, but there was an elevation of some of these facts. What is you make some reference to this investigation in your book. What is your assessment of that investigation and its impact on the Klan and on the broader situation in the South following Reconstruction?
Right. This is a complicated but important moment in the history of Reconstruction, and an instructive moment in our understanding of the history of the federal government. Right. To understand the history of Reconstruction, you understand the Ku Klux Klan, its origins in this era, and that it is a fraternal organization of Confederate veterans bonding around a deep antagonism towards the shift in history, the rise of the Republican Party, the kind of emergence of federal occupation, antagonism towards both white and Black Northerners who are coming to the South and are rearranging, right, the very fabric of a hierarchical Southern society. Obviously, a white supremacist organization. They do tremendous amounts of violence, especially in the elections of 1868. Several Southern elections are tipped. We should understand that Ulysses S. Grant does not win the White House without the Black Republican vote in the South. We should also understand that there are several Southern states where the Ku Klux Klan is decisive in tamping down, either through violence or through intimidation, the Black vote. The federal government does not take this lightly. We should understand that there was a retreat from Reconstruction in the late 1870s. But in the early 1870s, Ulysses S. Grant and the nascent Justice Department play a major role in targeting, investigating, and bringing Klan members to these hearings where they are asked to testify. This is where you get some of the complicated narrative around Nathan Bedford Forrest, who again is the forefather of the Klan, but is also a major turncoat in this moment and essentially helps spill some of the inner workings of the Klan. Now, the Klan is essentially broken as a collective organization, as a formal organization. White supremacy continues. A number of other paramilitary organizations jump in their place. White supremacy and white supremacist violence continue to be a major force in targeting Black politicians, targeting Black voters. But we should understand that this is a moment where the federal government does break the back of the Klan. The Klan will not emerge as a formal organization until the early 20th century, after Birth of a Nation, after the kind of rise of formal Jim Crow. But we do get a record. We get not only the testimony of Klan members, but also the testimony of freed people discussing how the Klan violence that they've witnessed, the specific terrain of the post-Civil War landscape, highlighting that this was not a moment of immediate political progress, that, again, as soon as Reconstruction began, Reconstruction was met with violence, and that would require the federal government to do something, right? And the Klan Acts, the Federal Enforcement Acts are part of this specific moment. It demonstrates that while the Klan violence, while white supremacist violence continued, the Klan in itself was broken, and that you have a map for how to target violence later, right? So again, doesn't do everything it could have possibly done, but does something, highlights the role of federal oversight in a way that during the 20th century, right, we'll see the Federal Bureau of Investigation under a figure like J. Edgar Hoover understand its role in targeting Klan violence, kind of using the federal government to protect the rights of Black Southerners, but also civil rights workers in the Second Reconstruction, in the third rise of the Klan during the 1960s.
I want to shift now a little bit and just discuss the Lowcountry as a focal point of Black political power, the evolution of a civic and political life in the Black community, and ask you to just compare sort of what, Beaufort County, that sort of center point of the Lowcountry, how it would compare to later hubs of African American culture and politics in places like Harlem or Chicago or here in Detroit. Where do you see parallels? What kind of how do you see them sort of part of a historical continuum? What are those relationships?
Right. One of the major themes, one of the major stories that organizes African American history is the story of movement, right? Whether that is involuntary movement in the form of the first and second Middle Passage during bondage, but also the quest for freedom, right? The escape to freedom during the Underground Railroad, the Great Migration of the 20th century that creates these hubs of Black social and cultural life in places like Harlem and Chicago and Detroit. One of the stories I want to highlight in this book is that the Lowcountry in the postbellum era was a hub of Black migration, not only for those who had been freed or escaping slavery during the Civil War and understood that when Union occupation began to rise, this could be a hub of protection from being returned to slavery, that Union lines and these refugee camps, these contraband camps could preserve Black family life, Black social life. But also after the war, after 1865, with the rise of the Freedmen's Bureau, many of those figures who understood that a new chapter in Black life was happening. This was a shift in the race's larger destiny, that there were political offices available, that there were opportunities in the Freedmen's Bureau for those who were literate. This is a kind of high watermark for Black attorneys. Many of those who were graduating from Howard Law School, the first Black law school in the nation, would go to the Lowcountry to serve as attorneys. The first Black law firm is in the country. It's found in Charleston. This continues, right? Through the 1860s, through the 1870s, people are participating in the Republican Party. They're seeking employment. This is a hub of Black land ownership. So not only are Black elites moving to the Lowcountry to engage in politics in ways that there were not political opportunities available even in the North for them, but those who were recently freed see this as a site to pursue autonomy, to acquire some of the land. As far as the promise of 40 acres and a mule was available anywhere in the United States, it was available in the Lowcountry broadly and Beaufort in particular, right? This is where Sherman's Field Order 15 was actually implemented, and that architecture of land ownership persists well into the early 20th century.
So it really was, so as you described, obviously a lot of us are familiar with the Great Migration that occurred in the 20th century, but there was a significant migration in the 1860s and 1870s because people were drawn to the Lowcountry and the opportunities for empowerment that existed at least for a while there.
That's exactly right. My good friend Caleb Gale has written a fantastic book titled Black Moses that examines some of the Western migration that happens after the end of Reconstruction, after 1876. And so we should put the migration to the Lowcountry and the Civil War in conversation with the exodusters, with some of these early migrations, right? There were many migrations to major Midwestern cities like Chicago and Detroit in the 1870s and 1880s before the Great Migration. And so there's a whole history of movement that is happening in the late 19th century that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of.
Well, Professor Bland, I really appreciate this conversation. I want to end this conversation or bring it to a close with a question that focuses on division in this country, and both the division that you write about in the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War, but also what we're experiencing now in the 21st century. One of the ways I read your book was a depiction of essentially this gradual reconciliation that occurred between the South and the North after the Civil War. And that in some ways, tragically, a price of reconciling the North and South was to abandon both the fact and the memory of why the Civil War was fought in the first place. In other words, to secure rights for African Americans, that memory was erased, or efforts were very successful in erasing that memory, not only in the South but also in the North, as if that was almost the price we had to pay in order to bring North and South back together. We're now in a period of intense division. Now, it isn't the same sort of sectional division. It's more of an urban-rural division in many ways, but it is a serious division. And I just wonder if you have some thoughts based on your deep reading of this history about any lessons we might learn from how this all played out in the aftermath of the Civil War, and how we might avoid a similar fate where we abandon certain populations or we other whole groups of people in order to be more unified as a country.
Right. Now, these Reconstruction questions are in many ways the questions of the hour in our current political moment. One of the major lessons from Reconstruction is the promise, peril, and pitfalls of making a truly democratic nation. Democracy is not a permanent destination. It is a project. It is unfinished. And right, you see so many books about Reconstruction talk about an unfinished revolution, or talk about its failed promise and the North Star into the distance that it represents. on the one hand, right, the historians of Reconstruction highlight that this is a moment where public schools for all are established, where property qualifications at the state level are removed, where, again, you see common cause being established between poor whites and poor blacks, and that the barrier of race is not a barrier for democracy, right? The project of a multiracial democracy, the nation that we herald, right, at Ellis Island, in the story of a nation of immigrants, right? That is in many ways a Reconstruction story. And at the same time, right, that story can be pushed against, right? The idea that actually too much democracy is bad, and that the march for progress will leave people behind, and that what we need is to return to hierarchy, right? Ben Tillman, the figure I talked about who established white supremacy in South Carolina, did so by convincing poor white farmers that they had more in line with white elites than they had with poor African Americans. That call to hierarchy, right? That was a call slaveholders had to make on the eve of the Civil War when they were speaking to white yeomen who, again, didn't benefit from a hierarchical society, but had to be convinced, right? Had to, and often, right, in the midst of the Civil War, you see so many of these accounts of abandonment of white yeomen and realizing that kind of, oh, this is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. We're seeing that again, where, again, the promise of multiracial democracy, the promise of the 14th Amendment, is being countered by a return to hierarchy. And this is not only the United States, across the world, right? You see regimes speaking language of authoritarianism, speaking in languages that isolate and target immigrants, that are slashing the social safety net. In many ways, right? These are anti-Black, anti-immigrant arguments, but these are also hierarchical arguments. These are arguments against democracy. What we're seeing is, right, a stress test for the health of democracy. And Reconstruction was one of these moments where an argument was made, a valiant fight was fought, and then it was tested. And that doesn't mean long-term defeat. One of the stories of Reconstruction, we talked about a grammar for American history, right? Reconstruction, some ways says 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But that doesn't mean that the fight ends, right? That doesn't mean that the struggle ends, right? The Reconstruction generation that I highlight understood that they could pass the story on to the next generation, that the John Lewis's and the Martin Luther King Jr.'s drew inspiration and lessons from the earlier fights that often, like the Reconstruction, had almost insurmountable odds, and yet they persisted. So I think even in our own moment where we're seeing concentrations of power, arguments for authoritarianism, you continue to see a vibrant democratic vision countering and contesting that limited vision of what a society can be.
I think that's really, really beautifully said, Professor Bland. And I would only add what you write about, which is what you've just spoken to, which is that the linchpin of a lot of these arguments for hierarchy really consists of a warning about safety, about exaggerated claims about the danger that people are in because of these, because of stories being told about immigrant populations or populations of color, and that's how the forces of hierarchy are, as they did in the 19th century, are once again trying to persuade people that they're better off accepting hierarchy because they're being somehow kept safe from these supposed threats. And it's a disturbing and really, really scary moment. But as you say, there are people who are standing up to this, who are insisting on their rights, insisting on the integrity of their community. Obviously, what we're seeing in Minneapolis is an example of people standing up and not accepting this anti-democratic, imposition of really almost essentially military rule, all in the name of protecting us. So I think your book has come out at a really important time, and it's been really, really tremendously educational for me personally to gain more exposure to this history. And I really appreciate you taking time today to elaborate on this and shed more light on what you've discovered in studying this. And I look forward to more of your work in the future. And just want to thank you on behalf of the Levin Center for joining us today.
Thank you for the kind words, Jim, and I appreciate all the work the Levin Center has done and continues to do on illuminating these questions of democracy. And I hope that we continue to hold on to that light of democracy and kind of what protecting democracy really looks like.
You're here. Well, again, to our listeners, to our viewers here, thank you all for joining us. If you want to learn more about the history we're describing here, obviously Requiem for Reconstruction is available, and really, I highly recommend you check it out, read it. There's a great deal to be learned there. If you want to learn more about any of the questions we were talking about related to oversight and the role of oversight in our democracy, please visit our website, levin-center.org. And with that, we'll say farewell for now, and thank you all again.